I want to start off by thanking Anthony and Roger and Dave and the entire team who put this together. It's a very unique gathering, and it's something that we look forward to every year, and we really appreciate having scholars with the expertise that you bring here at the Presidential Library. I would start off by saying if you want to get a good perspective on President Reagan's thinking, one of the best things you can do is look at his diary. And I was just reminded by Anthony that in terms of per capita, more people in this room have probably read Ronald Reagan's diary than any other group that you would get together. And you may know the history of it was, when he was governor of California, after the 8 years were over, he and Nancy Reagan sat down and they were trying to go through all the things that had happened. And as you know, when you're governor of a state like California, a lot happens, it happens fast, and they couldn't remember everything. So when he was elected president, he decided to keep a diary. So when he was out of office, they could think back and they would have the details they could remember. But what I think makes it very unique, and as scholars and historians you would appreciate, it wasn't written for history. It was written by President Reagan only for himself. He wasn't trying to position himself for greatness. He wasn't trying to settle any scores. It was just President Reagan's recollections of the day, his assessment of people that he met, and the things that really stuck with him. And it turned out when he left office, he gave the Reagan Foundation the rights to his diary, and we didn't know what we were going to do with it, and we figured, well, maybe we should publish it. And that, I can tell you that no person has spent more time reading and dissecting that diary than anyone except Doug Brinkley, including President Reagan. Doug edited the Reagan diaries for publication, so when we have a gathering like this and you need a historian to offer a keynote on a conference about the Age of Reagan, there's one very obvious choice. So thank you, Doug. Of course, we're in a room of scholars, and I don't need to educate you on Professor Brinkley's qualifications or remind you that in addition to editing the diaries, he's also written multiple best-selling books, including one of my favorites, The Boys That Point to Hawk. And he edited the notes of President Reagan. These were special things that President Reagan had clipped and kept in a binder that he would use when he was about to give a speech or when he was thinking about and making an important statement. So here at the Reagan Presidential Library, we're especially appreciative of Doug's immeasurable contributions to the study of President Reagan and the continued impact on today's society. In the Reagan diaries, Doug shared one very revealing anecdote that I wanted to quote. He writes, "Comedian Bob Hope once asked President Reagan how it felt to actually be the US president, to sit in the very office where Abraham Lincoln paced during the Civil War. President Reagan, with his charismatic smile, said, well, it's not a lot different than being an actor, except I get to write the script." So that script, his strategy, his decisions, his words, transformed a country and changed the world. But the point of this conference isn't to rewatch our favorite episodes with the best scripts or to wrap ourselves in the warmth of that nostalgia. It's to see how the script that Ronald Reagan wrote is instructive today. It's to unpack the layers, to better understand what happened so we can understand better what's happening now and what may help us guide our future. Ken Burns was here 2 weeks ago and he reminded us of the quote, while history doesn't repeat itself, it does rhyme. So let's look at the world since President Reagan. Has there been a time since he left office when understanding how to handle a Russian dictator has ever been important? Has a president had to deal with the Middle East on fire? What about navigating a dangerous anti-American regime in Iran? That was the crisis that greeted President Reagan just before his inauguration. Conversations about cutting taxes and right-sizing government. Well, President Reagan also passed some bills that were big and beautiful. So that's why here at the Reagan Foundation and Institute, we want to advance the work that you do and support you as scholars and historians. We want our archives to be a home for you, because the better we understand the script that President Reagan wrote, the better all of us will be at writing the script for future generations. That's the work which Doug Brinkley has dedicated himself to, not just for President Reagan, but for numerous other figures in both his writing and his scholarly work, as well as his service to many important national institutions. So please join me in welcoming best-selling author, Rice University presidential historian, and our great friend, Doug Brinkley, to join a fireside conversation.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doug. Sure thing. Thanks, Anthony.
Well, Doug, I think Fred mentioned that if I had to guess, just about everyone in this room has at least cracked the Reagan diaries. And if I had to take a second guess, when Nancy Reagan asked you to write those diaries, it was probably over a Cobb salad, maybe at the Hotel Bel Air. Do me a favor, walk us through that moment when First Lady Reagan asked you to edit the diaries, and then bring us all the way up to the final day when HarperCollins puts it out and you can finally open it up and share it with scholars in the room and the American public in general.
Well, thank you, Fred. Wonderful to be here. Always be in your presence. And my son, Johnny Brinkley, is at University of Southern California. He's in the back table there, and thanks for caring to come, Johnny. I greatly appreciate it. I was doing a lot of D-Day work. I was going over to Normandy, and we were building a National World War II museum in New Orleans. It began as the National D-Day Museum. So we interviewed D-Day veterans, and I had done some television from Normandy. And when I got back to my academic office, I had a letter. I used, people write in, they see you. And a woman named Lorraine Wagner had written me a random letter telling me that she had something about like 250 or so letters of Ronald Reagan wrote her. And my immediate thought was these must be form letters from like the campaign with the auto pen signature kind of bit. And I did call her, she asked to call, and then I interrogated. I said, could you just Xerox me one of the letters that you think's good? And she said, no, you have to come to Philadelphia. She said he wrote her because he had met her when she was his first fan club. She founded the Philadelphia Ronald Reagan fan club when he was a young actor, and they had stayed in touch all these years. And it was should I go or not? But something about the conversation made me think it's worth flying into Philadelphia. And I was in New Orleans at the time, and went to her house. She had worked for the Internal Revenue Service. And in a very small, modest home, she came and pulled out the boxes of these letters. And lo and behold, it was Ronald Reagan, even from his whole life, writing her and in non-form-like ways about anything, about his days in his presidency. It's a genuine correspondence. And I said, God, what do I do with this? This is good. And so I called editor David Remnick at the New Yorker, and I wrote a piece called Ronald Reagan's Pen Pal about Lorraine Wagner and President Reagan. And it turns out Mrs. Reagan, Nancy Reagan, knew about her, and there were photos. And after that kind of happened, and shortly after that, I got a call from Pete Wilson, who was working in California, and he said, would you be interested in looking at and maybe editing Ronald Reagan's diaries? And what diaries? And he said he kept them every day as president. And we had that conversation, except when he was shot at George Washington, hospital, or in DC. And when he woke up at George Washington Hospital, he continued. And at that point, I said, yeah, what do I have to do? He said, well, first off, I'm not offering these to you. You need to come out and meet Mrs. Reagan. And Joanne Drake's here, who knows more about every story of this era. But I met her, and Governor Wilson told me to be careful of two things when I had lunch with her. One, do not mention Edmund Morris. And it said, and if your conversation gets stilted, just talk about movies. And I said, movies she was in, or Ronald Reagan, she's anything on that sphere. And so we had a nice lunch. And at one point in the middle of the lunch, I was trying to figure out why me, because it felt a little bit like a gift. And I said, Mrs. Reagan, I just want you to know there are a lot of conservatives that might be die-in-the-wool conservatives that might be wondering why you're giving this, to me. because I'm not part of that movement. And she looked at me and she said, my son's more liberal than you could ever be. Something to that effect. And it was just a wonderful conversation, but the rub was you had to move out here basically because you couldn't Xerox them and had to go into the archives here. So my wife Ann and I moved here. Johnny, my son, who's now at USC, was a little boy out here, and we had our daughter Cassidy born in Thousand Oaks. And we used to be with Joanne Drake and Mrs. Reagan, and they kind of embraced us out here. And it was an incredible time doing the Reagan Diaries because, just the fact that you could feel what Joanne and Mrs. Reagan were doing. And the Edmund Moore's part, which he was hesitant because that of maybe throwing raw meat into the public sphere because you never know how things shake out.
So Reagan Diaries come out in 2007. Look, we've had a lot of presidents that have had reappraisals over the years. John Adams, largely unknown, then HBO makes a series about him, and all of a sudden he's a rediscovered hero. Jimmy Carter's having his kind of moment in the sun with historians and scholars across the country. Reagan Diaries comes out in 2007. What do you think the impact has been on this community and the kind of broader community they represent in contributing to a reevaluation, a reappraisal of Reagan's presidency?
Well, I think you have to put the Reagan Diaries in perspective. It makes perfect sense, and it was very smart that Ronald Reagan kept them handwritten in a book. He had spent his whole life handwriting. Scholars of young Reagan are going to find speeches and poems and articles, and he constantly wrote. And yet the diaries were a bit unusual in U.S. history. James K. Polk kept a diaries. Alan Nevins had edited them. I read it when I was in graduate school. Rutherford B. Hayes kept diaries. People will tell you sporadically, like Truman kept them a little bit, Eisenhower a little bit. But Reagan did it daily, and nobody knew about it. And if you think about him keeping it daily in 1981, Watergate is very fresh on people's mind. The Nixon tapes. Nixon didn't burn the tapes. Luke Nichters here is the expert really on the Nixon tapes. And, one of the reasons Nixon didn't burn the tapes, he thought he could do like Winston Churchill, write a multiple volume history, perhaps, Nixon, the age of Nixon. And so he let them go, and it turned out to be killed his presidency. And so Ronald Reagan, in a way, was very controlling. He could put what he wanted. I think the part that surprised me, if anybody tries to do a handwritten diary, that he didn't forget to do it day after day. There's nothing artificial about it. I did notice the only thing I thought about for posterity is he would never write, God damn or something. Sometimes, or if it was a curse word, he'd put a little dash instead of spelling out the word. It felt good reading them, and more I started learning because Professor Skinner is here. There she is, and she's all I could tell you from looking at Ronald Reagan's letters. She helped move Reagan's studies a giant leap forward, and now teaches at Pepperdine University and with the Hoover Institute, and does much more. And so there started becoming a thing that Clark Clifford saw that Reagan was an amiable dunce. Wasn't holding true, and when you really look at his whole body of work, as some of you will, as a writer and a thinker, it holds up pretty well. And then you recall the flash moments of like his debating Robert Kennedy in 1967 and beating Bobby Kennedy in a debate, and Kennedy said, "I didn't expect that. Reagan was the actor," and so there was always more there. I also believe, because people will talk about Goldwater and talk about Nixon, Reagan, the California presidents, Goldwater, because of Reagan's speech at the convention in San Francisco in '64. But he was an actor, and actors have a quality to take things from others and adopt them. And he did learn a lot from FDR, who he voted for 4 times, and he voted for Truman, but he liked FDR growing up. And his voice on radio. But what I feel sometimes gets missed is the influence Eisenhower and the amiable Ike had on Reagan. He turned Republican for Ike those 8 years, and there was a side of Reagan that didn't feel like he needed to prove himself as an intellectual. He could say, I'm reading Larry McMurtry's Anything But Billy, or I'm reading, the Boys of Summer, a baseball book, just like Eisenhower could read Louis L'Amour and Zane Grey pulp westerns. And he wasn't ever having that, trying to prove himself. In other words, I'm saying Reagan was a bit like a Macy's Day Parade float. It just floated over a lot of noise, which I never thought of him like that. That's how he got through with the press. He didn't keep enemies list. What he kept was a diary in a sock drawer that really only Nancy Reagan and him knew about, because they didn't want it getting subpoenaed or get in some sort of Washington tangle. So it was kept in a very discreet fashion. And the possibility of these diaries first surfaced when he wrote his autobiography, in which he mentions, as I wrote in my diary, subsequent presidents like Jimmy Carter would talk in some to a tape recorder. And in fact, I just found out that Jimmy Carter's 1976 notebook, a diary, so to speak, but it's a lot of telephone numbers and stuff in it, they just found in his attic when President Carter died, from the entire campaign, like, who should I pick to this happened here. Not like Reagan's per se, but there was that kind of tick-tock time element to it. The big thing was we didn't want redactions, and Mrs. Reagan did not want this to be redacted diaries. We wanted, I felt, and Joanne, it's just my feeling, and if I'm wrong about this, from your perspective, I accept that. But I always felt that if Ronnie wrote it, she wanted it out. There's no sense of a covering up for him. Like, if anything, she was more, who's censoring him? What do you mean they don't want what he wrote? There was a little bit of that to her. And when we went through the process, there was only a couple little bits. One on Saudi Arabia, arms and things mainly, but very, very little of something that couldn't come out from a classified perspective.
Great man history. You mentioned Winston Churchill. History will be kind because I'm the one who will write it. You mentioned Nixon, who certainly had an ambition to be a great man. It's out of vogue, right? It's out of vogue with scholars on university campuses. It's out of vogue with professional historians, and yet here we are at the Reagan Library, a temple to a great man. It's every Father's Day, Amazon warehouses are empties and bookshelves are emptied with the next presidential biography. I'm sure I've had several given to me over the years, and you probably have too, Doug. How do you square the circle between the thirst for great man history in the museum space, from the general public, and where the kind of disciplines of political science, of history, of the humanities in general are today? Those disciplines disavowing great man history as the right path forward.
I don't really call it great man history. I guess it's great persons, individuals, but the art of biography. When I was young, I would read childhood biographies of Paul Revere or Annie Oakley, types of things. And so anything that gets somebody young reading history of any kind is beneficial. I've always felt that in the United States, we even now, we're very much a celebrity culture. I mean, we're about what individuals have succeeded. And so I think the U.S. biography is very popular. And then if you cut to the fact that when you're really well known, people tend to save things, whether you're a president or a ball player, some people think it has worth because of the signature. So little things pop up now and then. FDR started the presidential libraries with the one at Hyde Park, New York. Unique site, a great American site, because FDR lived his whole life in that house, and he's buried there at Hyde Park, and it began the beginning of National Archives. And then we did all the presidents, went back one, so it didn't look like FDR was being too grandiose with the library for himself. They went back and did Hoover and onward all know it's gone, forward to every president's doing their presidential library. Barack Obama's is opening in the spring, June of 2026. And that one won't have quite the connection to the National Archives as others, because it's the foundational world is growing and taking over some of the tasks. It's the idea that we live chronological lives. People are born, people are die, and you can read, if you know, a historian friend of mine used to say, abandon chronology at your own peril. I mean, people don't know what is coming, so everybody kind of lives in that way. But I think it's more this celebration of Andy Warhol, celebrity America kind of feel that helps. Because if you go to Europe, they do like the biographies too, but not quite as much. There's, social history really tells you more about a time usually than an individual's life, about, whether it's labor history or, story of a race struggle or about women in America. I mean, there's so many forms. Great, all of you are here, or most of you here are great historians. But if you're asking about a marketplace, presidents are big. If you want to go to Simon & Schuster Random House and say, I want to get advance money to do a biography of Frank Church of Idaho, or pick your Senator Alan Cranston, California, they're not going to be interested. But if you pick a president, whether it's John Quincy Adams or Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter or Theodore Roosevelt, it's because in our country, we even do our eras. We'll call it the Kennedy years, the Johnson years, the Nixon. So from a marketplace, Barnes & Noble point of view, those books hit every demographic in every marketplace, every town, because we all lived in America during that particular presidency. So what's unfortunate in political history is it's harder to do that on senators or governors that may have had a super amount of importance, because they tend to have a more localized fan base.
You've written on a lot of presidents. I mean, I think I just picked up on your strategy. The advanced money is in picking a president. So now I know why you've written on so many presidents. Okay, understood.
Well, when you start with the university press world, my first book was on Dean Acheson, and you look at the university press world and you're going to be an assistant professor, associate, full professor, you do all of that. But if you're going, like I did a book on Theodore Roosevelt and the wilderness, conservation national parks, called The Wilderness Warriors, and with Harper, and then I did, for nothing, because they wouldn't give me anything for it, a book called The Quiet World on Alaska's Wilderness. And I was then told by a couple of people, including Walter Isaacson, why aren't you putting a name of somebody in your book? Because people tend to look at an individual in this country, and if you strip it of that, then you're looking at a policy perspective, and that's the university press realm, which actually produces the best histories in our country, the university press system. Those are the books that really do the detailed archival work. But when you get into that realm of biography of a well-known person, it perks up. Just a brilliant book on J. Edgar Hoover. We all know the name, and then I want to read a biography of J. Edgar Hoover because he intersects with everything I've studied. And in order to go and travel to all these archive sites, you either can apply for a grant, here's one here, one here, one here, to do that work of traveling, or you get an advance up front, which pays for that kind of traveling, so you don't have to do for a Guggenheim or a scholarship with that. So they're both a way to get you to go visit archival collections.
So let's circle back to all those presidents you've written on: Ford, Carter, Roosevelt, certainly Reagan. And I think if I asked for the differences between those presidents and polled this room, everyone's hands would shoot up with some obvious answers. But what are the similarities between those presidents, and where, what were maybe the decision points that maybe tamped down the similarities in their approaches?
Well, I mean, part of a previous question you had is we're talking about how when a president gets revived, where does you have a revisionism go? How the stock of presidents going up and down. And it is true, it can vary. I mean, when I was in a session today, we're talking about whether it's a hands-on president or a hidden-handed president. But somebody like Dwight Eisenhower, people had assumed for a while that because he had a heart attack, was golfing, and he had, surrounded by some good staff, that he really was not a hands-on president, that he kind of was just floating around somewhat. And then lo and behold, when the papers got open and Fred Greenstein at Princeton did his book and show, we started learning, no, Eisenhower was on top of everything. It was, and so now Eisenhower stock's gone way up because then you look at something like Andrew Jackson, our current president, is come to admire and hang his portrait. In the academic world, Jackson's been coming down due to the Trail of Tears and Cherokee removal. And so by nature, what president's in at the moment is going to depend on the present time. But so if you get a David McCullough to do a John Adams and it wins a big, huge prize and it's #1 on the New York Times and then HBO does it, people are going to start caring more about John Adams. And he did that with, Harry Truman. For most of us here, though, it's really when archives open and, there is Freedom of Information Act, 25 years, you got to wait and wait. And I think why you're all here for the Age of Reagan Conference is a lot of it is the great new archival material that's starting to be made available so you can really look at the Reagan's presidency in a coherent, more paper trail way. And in a session today, hearing about Taiwan and Lebanon and Grenada, and I realized, they're drawing on new archives all the time of things that are a way to look at and reassess. And I'll be curious to see in the next decade how Reagan studies is going, but it looks good because Reagan not only won 2 terms, he probably could have won a third. The drama of the near assassination and the fact that that era is a Cold War era president, and Reagan had been against the Soviet Union and what it stood for in philosophical thinking, political thinking, and also in his humor, that he stands out as a Cold War president to understand as we get further from, you have a long trajectory how Reagan evolved as an anti-communist, and then, 8 years, a lot of forces at play with Gorbachev and Perestroika and Glasnost and Margaret Thatcher and the Pope, and we could go on and on. But, the Berlin Wall came down in '89 and '91, the Soviet Union collapsing. And whether we like it or not, we live in a visual YouTube clip era and a soundbite. And, Reagan's Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, just continues to kind of have a kind of holds court with the best of, John F. Kennedy asked not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And Bill Clinton's soundbite is, I did not have sex that way. That's a soundbite problem, if that's the one. And yet Bill Clinton's speech at Oklahoma City, bombing was amazing, but things aren't all equal. Legacies have to be managed of presidents, and you don't stop being the president when you leave the White House, because one way or another, people are associated, your peers, staff, their whole life is associated with you. So presidents, even when they leave, try to do something to not damage their reputation or make sure that you're able to, maybe have a gold star in history.
All right, so I know it's your summer break, and I know it's all of your summer breaks, but I'm going to ask you to do a bit of grading right now. We have the Age of Reagan Conference banner behind us. We have Steve Hayward in the audience, author of a 2-volume Age of Reagan, which I'm sure everyone has read, or should. Sean Wilentz also wrote a book on Age of Reagan. Is Age of Reagan the right frame right idea to look at the history of the United States in the late 20th century?
I reviewed Sean Wilentz's Age of Reagan in the New York Times when it came out, and I liked it, but it interested me because the book, how Sean did that book, because I knew he was very close to Sid Blumenthal and Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, and the fact that he was kind of putting a spotlight on Reagan that way, coming from where Sean was coming from, it interested me, and he's a good historical writer. There was an Age of Reagan. I mean, when you're president for 8 years, you can claim that. That's a long time to be in the White House. And then you add the most populous state, California, and the governorship to it, and then you add that entertainment career of film, and you're really looking at a long trajectory. So I think the term Age of Reagan's appropriate. In fact, Beverly, Professor Gage, I was chatting with her a little bit ago, and she started making me think. I've been teaching at Rice University for quite a while now, of course, on the 60s and 70s. And as a professor, you get into a rote kind of thing, and due to the Nixon tapes and others, I'm always finding fresh things in that era, believe me, always, But I think there probably needs to be more looking at the 80s and 90s now as more documentation's being made available. The Clinton library, because Hillary Clinton was running for president, it was a big deal for a long time there. It seemed to be slow, the Clinton studies. But once the release of the Reagan diaries and the letters that I mentioned of Professor Skinner, and there started becoming, and the Age of Reagan, and work started just snowballing. And I think it's just really beginning now, the true scholarship of looking. It takes 25, 30, 40 years to kind of get a perspective that at least will have modernity embedded in it.
I'll take that as an A+.
Well, it's an A book. It's a good book, what Sean did, and it's you got to judge books by what their purpose is. I mean, it's a nice book to read. It's a page turner. It brings you to that point. It might make you go look for other things. It's not trying to reinvent the wheel with it, but it was one of these progenitor books.
Well, Doug, thank you so much for joining us on stage tonight for our keynote address. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me.
Thank you, Fred, for having it, and Joanne. Thank you. Good job.